Peace and blessings be upon you. Today, it's a little uncomfortable due to the rain, so I'll try to condense the lesson on the infamous Paul. There's a general consensus among most Muslims that Paul was a corrupter, and that many of the verses in the Quran, which are condemning people for falsifying religiosity, are directed at some of the founders of Christianity. And in my investigation of what is the true Injil, I've absorbed the work of a number of perspectives, Unitarian Christian believers, semi-atheist scholars, Marcionite leaning scholars, and much like this palm tree, the general lesson that I'm taking is that there were degrees of guidance among different parties in early Christianity, and there was an overabundance of spiritual liquidity, and things became uprooted. But it was a gradual process, and there isn't a single individual who is squarely to blame, except perhaps the Emperor Constantine, who minted a coin that said Constantine Divus, the divine Constantine. And like this tree, there is still some hope that there's a salvageable life in the uprooted tradition. So in the case of Paul, not all of Paul's letters are generally understood to be written by Paul. And the ones that are considered pseudepigraphal are the ones that contain some of the most licentious Christology and have the infamous astral projection into paradise in Galatians. Whereas the authentic Paul letters are still grounded in a Unitarian monotheism, whereby there's a very optimistic sense of what God has in store for us vis-a-vis the day of judgment. And indeed, a lot of this Pauline terminology of a resurrected superbody is in the Quran. And then when we look at the Gospels, it's understood generally that Mark was written in the 60s due to another coin issue with the denarius being referenced instead of the temple shekel. And now there's a more modern wave of scholarship based on the theory of Marcion priority, whereby even Mark is either early 2nd century or is post-Marcion, and that Luke is most definitely a polemical variation on Marcion's Evangelion, and that Matthew would be a somewhat more Hebrew influenced one. So then there's the question of the Q source, and which is a theoretical common link isnod for both of these gospels, where we isolate the sayings, the hadiths, and we can see that those hadiths, divorced from their narrative context of the specific penal atonement theology, do seem more Quranically aligned. But it just goes to show you that if the hadith situation is very problematic over 500 years later, that the situation in the 1st and 2nd centuries is even more problematic. So one thing that you take away from all of this scholarship is it's very difficult to really know, and that the most intellectually honest thing about a lot of these hadiths and alleged scriptures is agnosticism about their dating. The best we can do is formulate theories such as Q, or interpolating things that church fathers said polemically about other sects, including Marcion, which is how we are able to construct the Marcion priority theory, or possibly in the first century, the Gospel of the Ebionites, or thanks to the Nag Hammadi dig, we have texts such as parts of the Gospel of Thomas. Now, we generally understand that the Gospel of Thomas version that we have is a second century manuscript with Gnostic or Manichaean ideas infused into it, some of the mystical aspects. But otherwise, there may well be the earliest dated gospel sayings in the non-Gnostic parts. So people were quite shameless about pseudepigraphy and about grafting things in. And then the number one thing that I would say to Christians, rather than trying to beat them over the head with a theological argument or even an argument from the Old Testament, because they have arguments from Exodus that would say that the Shema says Eshad and Eshad, the two become one Eshad flesh in Genesis. And these arguments are difficult. And if you argue from the authority of the Quran, then you have to deconstruct all the horrible infamy around it from the Hadith and Sirah tradition, and get them aligned on a Mutazili or Quranist understanding of the Quran in order to really even begin to have the conversation. And then you have to go through a number of points about the Quran itself, and it becomes a very long conversation before you can get to an argument for Unitarian theology. So the number one thing that I would say to Christians is to read John 13 and 14 versus John 15 through 17. And what that shows you is that it's two different versions of the same Last Supper discourse scene with two different theologies, one Trinitarian, one Unitarian. And so when you look at debates between Christians who are Unitarian and Christians who are Trinitarian, they will refer to Scripture and they will make a scriptural argument. And they believe in the Scripture. They don't have... So the funny thing about being a Muslim is that you claim to be sitting on top of a skyscraper of Abrahamic scriptural and prophetic tradition, but that you're on the top floor and the middle floor, the Injil, is basically like one of those buildings where they're missing a floor and it's just four pillars, and that would be the skeletal things that are in the four Gospels that are committed to by the Quran. The Quran makes references to